Hey all, back with another Spotlight with Context, and today we're talking about the Dark Phoenix kit. Apologies ahead of time if my voice gives out in this one. I've recorded a few of these in a row ahead of a vacation, so don't look for streams in the upcoming week, but good luck on polls for anyone engaging in that. Um, if you are watching this back later, then maybe she will not have the current price tag attached to her, but for now, that is kind of in the background here. I fully understand that, so I'm just going to quickly acknowledge that she does have very good prestige, if that matters to you. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the champion attributes. So survivability of 3.5 here. She has access to immortality, which keeps her alive. She has safeguard and damaging effect reduction. Like, you can just die with her, absolutely. But there are a lot of overlapping things that mitigate just how hard you get hit by almost anything, and that tends to keep her healthy, right? Damage of 3.5. She's not quick here. A lot of her damage is honestly a little more defender leaning, but she can get a really big fury, and then that can lead to some significant damaging effects and big hits. And so in a longer fight, the damage is respectable, right? And that's kind of what this is getting across. Ease of use 4. The way you use her as an attacker is kind of just to do full combo, special 1, special 2, and then just keep hitting the opponent, right? So, like, that's definitely fair here. Utility of 2.5. Most of her utility is kind of wrapped up in her survivability. She has immunities and resistances, but she also has Pulverize, and so that adds together to definitely a functional utility character, but not necessarily a high utility character. And then Defender Strength of 4.5 is probably the reason a lot of y'all are here, because her mechanics are tough. So I'm kind of going to gloss over strengths and weaknesses because a lot of this doesn't necessarily make sense until we get into the kits later, or is, kind of stating things that we'll cover. But she does have Safeguard, which is an effect that's normally on a node and requires some talking about, and so we'll cover that when we get there. She has access to Nova Flame, which means that her damaging effects are almost impossible to resist. I think it's just Torch and Iceman that can't be hit with Nova Flame. Um, all of that adds up to slowing down the opponent, which is good if you're trying to stay alive and also dangerous as a defender. And we talked about she has Pulverize, which is a pretty reliable method of armor control. Weaknesses, Atrophy in particular is great for messing with her safeguard, and we'll chat about that as we get there. There are a few things in here that help mitigate her threat specifically when she's poisoned, so that's something that you're going to want to look for too. Then Buff Immune and Fate Seal can get around her punishment of nullifying, staggering, or reducing the ability accuracy of her buffs. We'll talk about that a bit more. And then pretty much all of her damage is energy, especially on defense, and so energy resistance is a great way to slow things down. Getting right into it with the abilities, she is immune to Incinerate, Nova Flame, and Power Drain. So Nova Flame is obviously a very rare resistance that means she can technically fight herself and do that, but I'm not sure I'd recommend it. It also means that she can fight Torch, and there's an Acropolis fight with Sunspot that does this. That's kind of a niche piece of utility, but Incinerate is quite common, and immunity to Power Drain is very helpful as well. This combined with Pulverize also makes her solid for future Ant-Man, calling that out. And then her ability and combat power rates cannot be reduced by more than 50%. So we haven't used this exact wording before, but it is a little bit different, right? This isn't a lock at 50%, right? The way that Enchantresses works. This is actually measuring what her ability and combat power rates are at the start of the fight, and then putting a floor at half of that. This takes place just before the start of the fight, this measuring, and so that means that, like, this won't take into account a node like Enhanced Power Gain on node 46 in the Alliance War map. That won't make this floor 100%, right? It will still have a floor of 50%, and then it will be increased to 200%, but you could then reduce it down to 50% with somebody like American Chavez, right? Similarly, the combat power rate is accounting for the fact that not all characters have the same base combat power rate. And so, as a 7-star, she's going to have that 120% all the time, and so it means that the floor is 60%. Now, these rates can increase from there, but that is how she sets her minimum. And then lastly here, if any of her personal buffs fail due to ability accuracy reduction, or are removed due to stagger or nullify, they re-trigger as a passive. So this does mean that you can prevent her stuff with Fate Seal, and it means you can either prevent or remove her stuff with buff immunity, as has been called out. But I do want to call out that when you apply a Fate Seal, the buffs it removes as it applies are considered to be nullified, right? And so when you first apply the Fate Seal, it will re-trigger her buffs as a passive. And that is very important if you are, for example, hoping to be able to fire a Fate Seal into her while she's unstoppable. Fate Seal is still potentially a way to answer her, but you're probably going to want it to be a longer Fate Seal, such as from somebody like Hood, so that it can actually outlast the passive it will trigger, and then allow you to do damage. And that passive, of course, I'm talking about is Safeguard, which we'll get to in a couple bullets. So, next section, Phoenix's Flame. Dark Phoenix gains up to 15 Ember Charges. These are indefinite and increase the potency of her Nova Flames by 20% per charge, so that is up to 300% increase from these. She gains a charge when landing a second medium, or when her Safeguard prevents damage. So that doesn't just mean while the Safeguard is active and she takes damage, it specifically means when the Safeguard caps that damage and prevents it from going higher. And then she loses a charge when she's knocked down by a special, and gains 5 at the start of each fight as a defender. And that is going to matter later. So we can go ahead and move on to the Safeguard. At the start of each fight, she gains a 5% Safeguard buff for 10.5 seconds. The damage threshold of this effect is 20% lower when she has class advantage, and 40% higher when she has class disadvantage, and its potency cannot otherwise be modified. This is actually pretty important and is mostly player beneficial, right? Because if this was completely static, then in a weird way, tech champions would actually be better against her than mystics, because mystics would be punished for doing more damage with their class advantage, and tech champions would benefit from having an attack reduction. So that's what that part is accounting for. And then the potency modification is to account for the fact that if you reduced the potency of this buff, you would actually make it more dangerous, which is really, really weird, right? If you were able to use something like Destroyer's Hinder on this, you would be hurting yourself by lowering the damage cap. And so that's why its potency is completely locked. All of that extra text is normally the kind of thing that would be working against the player, but I want to call out that it's to make things more intuitive and consistent for you to counter. Let's talk about Safeguard as a type for a minute, because I think it's often misunderstood. The way Safeguard works is that it is specifically for incoming hit events, right? Not necessarily hit damage, but hit events. Safeguard is active at the same time that something like Disorient would be active, right? Dark Phoenix has to be getting struck or blocking an incoming attack. During those frames, when she is being attacked, what Safeguard then does is it puts a ceiling on how much damage any one instance of damage can do. And then that will apply separately to each of the sources of damage. The reason that's important is because it means that the hit damage itself is capped to 5% of her health. And then separately, any other damaging effects are also capped at 5%, right? So if you're fighting her with somebody like Absorbing Man, his hit is capped at 5%, and then the burst he deals when he's striking is also capped at 5%. This also means that if somebody is applying multiple effects in that frame, then each of those will be individually capped, but they can add up to something larger than the cap. The problem is that red numbers in our game, the way they display on the HUD, they are combined when they happen in the same frame, and so it may sometimes look like red numbers are bypassing this cap, even though they aren't. That will just mean that those red numbers are actually multiple damage events, or potentially that they're happening a little bit later than you think they are after the actual hit event, right? So hopefully that adds some clarity there. Feel free to go back and listen to that a couple times if you need to, because we haven't really talked a lot about this, and this is the first time we've ever used this effect on a champion, so I really wanted to break it down so that even though it's going to be annoying to deal with, I want it to at least be pretty predictable. This safeguard is removed when the opponent activates a special 3, so special 3s can avoid this cap. And as an attacker, whenever it reduces damage, right? So if the opponent tries to deal 7% damage to you, you cap it to 5%, then you lose the safeguard, right? So that it doesn't just allow you to completely tank a full incoming combo or special, and then it reactivates every 10 seconds. So note the duration is 10.5 seconds, the reactivation is every 10 seconds. That means that if there are no duration shenanigans going on here, the safeguard will always reactivate before it expires, and so will never expire naturally, right? That means that most of the time it is always active. However, if you can reduce the duration of it, you will have a window where it's just not there at all, even though you didn't have to remove it with Nullifier Stagger. And then at 5 or more Ember Charges, and remember as a defender she starts with 5, Safeguard also reduces the potency of incoming damaging effects and power stings from champions by 75%. So if you're fighting with her, you're not going to be able to get around node sources of damage, but you are going to be very well protected from champions. Now this might look a little bit more heavy-handed than it actually is, because it does mean starting off, yeah, your damaging effects, including burst damage, are heavily, heavily nerfed. But if you can stay under the safeguard threshold and avoid giving her extra charges from it preventing damage, you can remove these charges by knocking her down with a special, and then that disables this part, right? Because if you can get her Ember Charges down below 4, there are other ways they go up, but I want to focus on this for a minute. If you can get those Ember Charges down below 4, then this line ceases to function, and then your damaging effects and power stings work just fine. So moving on to her Nova Flame section. When she reaches 10 or more Ember Charges for the first time each fight, she gains a Phoenix Rising charge. So you can avoid her ever getting to this if you avoid all of the triggers for her Ember Charges, which basically means avoid the special 1 and avoid triggering her safeguard threshold, right? But assuming you don't avoid her getting to 10 charges, she's going to get this charge, this Phoenix Rising effect. When she would be knocked out, this is consumed and turns into an immortality buff for 12 seconds. Because this is one of her personal buffs, it will re-trigger as a passive if it's nullified, staggered, or prevented with ability accuracy, so be careful with those. But you can reduce the duration of it, such as with atrophy, right? When this charge is consumed, the opponent is immediately inflicted with a Nova Flame passive for 20 seconds, which reduces block proficiency by 60%, so that's more than normal incinerates. And as a defender, this damage scales with base attack only, so you don't have to worry about it being juiced further by nodes or by her fury. If she is suffering from poison when this Nova Flame is activated, the duration is reduced by 20% per poison. And so Mystics can reduce this all the way down to 0 if you have enough poisons. But when you are not fighting her with a Mystic, so if you're using somebody like a Mortal Abomination, then you can't reduce it more than 40%. Now, reducing it by 40% is reducing this 20 seconds by 8 seconds, which is potentially saving you from a fair bit of damage, both from the effect itself and from the block proficiency reduction. So that still matters, but Mystics with Poison are significantly better. Then Dark Phoenix passively regenerates health equal to 100% of the energy damage she deals while she is immortal. So as this Nova Flame is ticking away on her opponent, she is then gaining that health for herself. Moving on to the heavy attack, this pulverizes 2 armor ups if they're active, dealing a burst of damage for each one removed. That direct damage is fairly standard across pulverizes, but this is just clarifying that you only get the direct damage if you're removing an armor up. Additionally, when you remove an armor up this way, you get an Ember Charge. When finishing her special attacks, she continues siphoning energy from the Phoenix Force over 3 seconds, which tells you you have 3 seconds until she inflicts the opponent with her Nova Flame. That 3 seconds isn't super important on offense, but on defense this matters because you're going to want to strike her as much as possible during this 3 seconds to reduce the duration of this Nova Flame by 13% per hit. So some quick math, if you do a 5-hit combo in that time, you're getting a 65% reduction, which is going to mean a lot less damage from Nova Flame and a lot less time where you have your own block proficiency reduced. This does technically mean that multi-hit basics can take this lower. It's very difficult to strike her a lot more than 5 times, right? Like, you can theoretically get to almost a full shutdown if you can hit her 8 times. And, using a striker helps, but doing that every time she throws a special attack to get this down to 0 is going to be really, really difficult. Unless you're using a Mystic who has a lot of individual hits, right? And there aren't a lot of those in the Mystic class. So I'm not saying just go find one, but I'm calling out in the future that's kind of something to be looking for, either in your partial counters now or in better counters in the future, right? Multi-hit basics are helpful for her. Now, Special 1 on activation gains an unstoppable buff for 5 seconds. As an attacker, the duration is decreased by 5% per Ember Charge, excluding permanent ones, right? So, as an attacker, this basically just means that as you're ramping and doing more damage and getting ready for your big furies, you're not going to be unstoppable literally all the time, because a 5-second unstoppable on the Special 1 is quite good. What this means on defense is that when she throws the Special 1, if you don't have an answer to unstoppable, you're not going to be able to hit her a bunch and reduce the duration of that Nova Flame, right? So an unstoppable counter or pushing her to Special 2 is pretty important here. Another wrinkle of the anti-unstoppable to shout out, something like slow technically means the unstoppable buff would fail due to ability accuracy. It's just that the follow-up unstoppable passive will also fail due to ability accuracy because that's how slow works. But I'm bringing this up because if you're using somebody with decelerate, let's say a 50% decelerate, you could theoretically fail the buff and then have the passive succeed. So try not to be surprised by that. On to the second bullet. On activation, gain 3 Ember Charges. That's the other reason that you want to try and avoid the Special 1, because as we called out earlier, if you're knocking her down with specials, you can get her Ember Charges low enough that your damaging effects deal full damage. It's really difficult to maintain that if she's throwing the Special 1 frequently. Especially because if she's also at 5 or more Ember Charges, which as a defender she probably is, then she also gains a power gain buff, granting 15% of max power over 5 seconds. So that is about half of a bar. She can stack 2 of these, If you let her throw the special one, she's going to be throwing a lot of special ones, is basically what this means. As an attacker, this buff gains an additional 10% flat potency, so it's going to be most of a bar, just kind of allowing her to throw a lot of specials. The special 2 on activation roots the opponent. There are a lot of little hits in this attack, if you remember Phoenix's existing special 2. And so if your block proficiency is being tanked by a Nova Flame, let's say, this can hurt quite a bit, right? It is otherwise not that bad, and Mystics can use block regen to mitigate this. Energy resistance is nice for this, but the block damage threat here is real because of that root. It's very difficult to just avoid all of this. Somebody who could, miss or evade or otherwise deal with incoming hits is going to be nice too. And then on activation, she also gains a Fury buff for 35 seconds, but this Fury gets stronger for each Ember Charge. Remember, she can have up to 15 Ember Charges, and so 15 times 30 is going to give you 450 total potency, which means that this Fury buff can be up to 5.5 times as strong. And then it lasts for a very long time. So the non-stacking thing means you don't have to worry about it getting much bigger, but it does mean that in addition to the whole Nova Flame block proficiency thing, she's going to start hitting harder when you push her to the special 2. Now, most of the time in my personal experience, that's worth it given the threats on the special 1, but it's something to be aware of anyway. As an attacker, this attack also consumes half of all Ember Charges at the end of it, because you're gonna need to keep ramping somehow. You can't just sit on these big Furies, right? And then special 3, she gains 3 permanent Ember Charges, which cannot be removed, so these just help you with your ramp being that much easier every time. Can be worth using the power gain to throw a few of these in a longer fight. And inflicts an indefinite Nova Flame passive. As a defender, this scales with base attack only, but as a defender, if you've been hit with this, you have some other problems. As an attacker, you can get up to 3 of these. And so both of those effects are effectively 3 times per fight, right? You get permanent Ember Charges and a permanent Nova Flame passive. Every time you throw this, you gain a non-stacking power gain buff, granting 100% of max power over 30 seconds. This is very similar to Purgatory's Special 3, where it's a slow extra trickle of power, but over time is going to let you throw more specials. And then the signature ability, as a defender, she gains a Phoenix Rising charge at 5 Ember Charges instead of 10, so right away as a defender, she has access to her immortality, and unfortunately, this cannot be removed, right? That is a pretty important consequence of this, the signature ability on defense, is you can reduce the Ember Charges. You can turn off her damaging effect reduction. You can't remove the Phoenix Rising charge, and so that means that if you're facing a duped Dark Phoenix, you are going to be dealing with immortality, you are going to be dealing with at least one Nova Flame in there, unless you manage to full-on prevent it, right? And that's why atrophy is that important, because if that is going to show up and it's going to keep you from killing her and it's going to mean you're taking damage and she's healing for it during that time, you're probably going to want to reduce the duration of that buff. Additionally, at the start of each fight, the health threshold for Safeguard is lowered by up to 60%. That means that 5% can come down to 2. This is still increased against Mystics and decreased against Techs, so it accounts for class advantage, but 2% is a lot stricter than 5%, and so not triggering that threshold and giving her extra Ember Charges becomes that much harder. Lastly, while immortal, her special attacks are passively unblockable. That can be a significant problem if you push her to the special 2, and it's both unblockable and rooting you with the Giant Fury, so be very careful as you are dealing with that last bit of the fight. Moving on to synergies with Phoenix. Dark Phoenix becomes passively unblockable while her personal Unstoppable is active, which, as we talked about, The unstoppable does get shorter as you ramp, but this can still be a lot of unblockable, especially for her special one. And then Phoenix, during the opponent's special attacks, cannot gain power and pauses her personal power gain effects. So this is an interesting bit, because this basically gives you more time to react to Phoenix's sometimes overwhelming power gain, right? Because often with Phoenix, you're going to want to throw those special ones, gain a bunch of power gains, and then try to throw the special two before you go red, and that can be difficult. This is giving you a bit more time for that, right? Because it's pausing the power gains, you still gain the same total amount of power, but this means that you're not going to go red before you have the ability to press the special button again. And that's going to make lining up that special 2 and keeping her damage under your control much easier. Next up, we rise with Jean Grey. Dark Phoenix starts each fight with 2 permanent Ember Charges, which cannot be removed and won't be consumed by the special 2, so you just have much better ramp. And then all champions on the team gain 8% health. Past relations with Cyclops' blue team. Dark Phoenix gains a precision buff when intercepting the opponent. You have a big Fury, landing more crits is going to be nice, and then Cyclops gains critical damage rating, which is a nice benefit to his many precisions. Ancient powers with the 2 Iron Fists. Dark Phoenix can pulverize a 3rd armor up, which will also give her an extra Ember Charge if it's available. And then the 2 Iron Fists gain extra armor rating and extra combat power rates. Just a nice little bonus there. She also has a teammate synergy with Wolverine, Beast, Professor X, and Storm, which is just your classic perfect block chance. And yeah, that's Dark Phoenix. She can definitely be fun on offense, just, throwing your special ones, ending in mediums, pulverizing away armors, getting a big Fury off the special 2, and just hitting opponents until they die. But we all know her primary impact is going to be on defense, for sure. She is tough. There are answers. We tested quite a bit of them. There are things to figure out and wrinkles to this kit, but she is tough. Yeah, I don't really have much more on that other than, like I said, work on being able to push her to the special 2, work on your special 2 dexes so you can safely avoid certain hits in it to limit your block damage, and practice safely punishing it so you can hit her as many times as possible to keep those Nova Flame durations down. With that, let me know what y'all are thinking in the comments. Please let's try and leave the acquisition method out of this discussion. I'm just not going to spend much time on those. Not going to stop you from leaving them, although I will delete them if they're rude, but just, a heads up there, if we can try and keep the focus on the kit, that is more what the purpose of this video is. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.